Picture a world where merchants from distant lands bartered not just goods, but entire ways of life, where a single trade route could determine the fate of empires. 5,000 years ago, long before shipping containers or stock markets, ancient civilizations were already mastering the art of the deal. But these weren't just simple exchanges of silver for spices or timber for textiles. These were the original blueprints of globalization, the hidden threads that wove together the fabric of history itself. From the bustling markets of Mesopotamia to the riverbanks of the Indus Valley, trade agreements did more than move merchandise. They moved mountains, toppling old powers and raising new ones in their wake. What if I told you the first written contract in human history wasn't about land or marriage, but a receipt for barley and wool? That's the astonishing truth buried in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer. These early deals were more than business transactions. They were acts of diplomacy, innovation, and sometimes even survival. Kings traded not just to fill their treasuries, but to secure alliances. Artisans borrowed techniques from strangers 1,000 miles away, blending styles into something entirely new. And ordinary people, their lives were forever changed by access to goods and ideas once unimaginable. This was the quiet revolution that built our modern world, one handshake at a time. So how did these ancient agreements work, and why do they still matter today? The answer lies in the unexpected ways trade reshaped everything from the languages we speak to the foods we eat, even the gods we worshipped. Over the next minutes, we'll retrace the footsteps of history's first entrepreneurs, uncovering how a simple exchange of goods could spark wars, inspire religions, and forge connections across continents. You'll see how a deal struck in a Bronze Age marketplace still echoes in today's global economy, and why understanding these ancient bargains might just hold the key to our shared future. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about the invisible forces that still bind us together. Let's begin. Long before gold coins jingled in merchants' pouches or contracts bore royal seals, trade began with something far more fragile: human trust. In the sun-baked cities of Sumer, a farmer might hand over his barley harvest to a trader, receiving in return not money, but a promise of cedar wood from distant mountains. No lawyers, no banks, just the weight of a handshake and the unspoken rules of reciprocity that bound communities together. This was barter in its purest form: goods for goods, need for need, and it worked because survival itself depended on cooperation. But here's what's fascinating: these early exchanges weren't just practical, they were revolutionary. Take the humble grain silos of ancient Egypt. When harvests overflowed along the Nile, surplus wheat became a bargaining chip for luxury goods like Lebanese cedar or Nubian gold. Suddenly, abundance in one place could fill scarcity in another, knitting together regions that had never before been connected. And with each exchange came something unexpected: innovation. Imagine a Sumerian merchant squinting at a pile of silver rings, realizing he needed a fair way to measure their worth. That moment of frustration birthed standardized weights, carved from stone and trusted across empires. Then came the real game changer: writing. Picture a clay tablet pressed with wedge-shaped marks, the world's first receipt, recording that so many jars of olive oil were owed. What began as simple accounting in Uruk's temples soon evolved into cuneiform, transforming human communication forever. Think about that. The written word, one of humanity's greatest achievements, owes its existence to the need to track sheep and barley. Commerce didn't just move goods, it moved minds, pushing people to invent, adapt, and collaborate in ways no one had imagined. These networks of trust became the invisible scaffolding of civilization. A single trade route could carry more than spices, it carried ideas. A potter in the Indus Valley might mimic designs from Mesopotamia, while a Babylonian scribe borrowed Egyptian symbols. Languages blended, gods were shared, and technologies spread. The real currency wasn't just silver or grain, but knowledge itself, passed from hand to hand like the most precious commodity of all. And though millennia have passed, that same spirit of connection still pulses through every market, every deal, every time we trust a stranger to hold up their end of a bargain. Baked into the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia lies a secret most history books overlook. The first written contracts weren't dry legal documents, but lifelines holding entire civilizations together. Take the Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone nearly 4,000 years ago. It didn't just list punishments for thieves, it set the price of barley down to the shekel, dictated fair wages for ox drivers, even guaranteed refunds for faulty boat repairs. This wasn't just law, it was an ancient blueprint for economic fairness, proving that commerce couldn't thrive without trust etched deeper than cuneiform symbols. What's astonishing is how modern these agreements feel. A typical contract from might detail interest rates on silver loans, penalties for late deliveries, or witnesses to attest to the deal, elements any lawyer would recognize today. But here's where it gets fascinating. These tablets often bore the seals of kings and gods, turning mundane transactions into sacred oaths. Break a promise to a merchant, and you weren't just cheating a man, you were defying divine order. That's why temples doubled as economic hubs, their altars serving as early notary offices where deals were sealed under the watchful eyes of deities. The real power of these contracts, they turned strangers into partners across vast distances. A merchant in Assyria could ship tin to Anatolia, trusting that the local ruler would enforce their agreement, not because of armies, but because the rules were sacred. Dispute resolution was baked into the system too. One tablet from Lhasa records a heated argument over missing copper shipments, resolved not by violence, but by sworn testimony before elders. Imagine that, a Bronze Age courtroom where evidence outweighed brute force, but perhaps the most revolutionary clause hid in plain sight, the concept of force majeure. Ancient contracts accounted for floods, bandits, even rebellions, excusing delays caused by the hand of the gods. This wasn't just legal nuance, it was wisdom. These societies understood trade couldn't flourish without flexibility, without acknowledging that some risks were beyond human control. In that admission lies a lesson we're still grappling with today. The strongest economies aren't built on rigid control, but on systems resilient enough to bend without breaking. What began as receipts for wool and grain became the glue of empires. When Babylon traded with Egypt or the Indus Valley, contracts traveled with caravans like diplomatic passports, proving that words on clay could be mightier than swords. They wove a web of mutual obligation so strong that even wartime couldn't always sever it. After all, enemies today might be trading partners tomorrow, a truth as old as commerce itself. Deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, miners chipped away at blue stones that would travel farther than they could ever imagine. Lapis lazuli, a gem so rare it became the ultimate status symbol from Mesopotamia to Egypt. But this wasn't just about beauty. When Queen Puabi of was buried with her lapis jewelry, or when pharaohs lined their tombs with it, they weren't just showing off wealth. They were proving their cosmic connections. See, this vibrant blue wasn't just pretty, it mirrored the heavens themselves, turning whoever wore it into a living bridge between earth and sky. That's why kings would trade literal tons of silver for it, why artisans ground it into sacred pigments for temple walls. Now imagine the journey. A single lapis bead might pass through a dozen hands, from Afghan miners to Indus Valley middlemen, up the Persian Gulf on reed boats. then overland by donkey caravan to Sumerian cities. Each transfer added value, mystery, and prestige. By the time it reached a royal court, that stone wasn't just a commodity. It was a story, proof that its owner commanded networks stretching beyond the horizon. And Lapis was just the beginning. Lebanese cedar, so fragrant and rot-resistant that Egyptian pharaohs built funeral barges from it. Baltic amber, warm as sunlight, and traded all the way to Mycenae. These weren't purchases, they were power moves. Here's where it gets fascinating. The elites didn't just collect these treasures, they weaponized them. When a Mesopotamian king gifted cedar oil to a neighboring ruler, it wasn't generosity. It was diplomacy, a way to say, "Look what routes I control." When Cretan princes hoarded ostrich eggs from Africa, they weren't decorating, they were demonstrating access to realms others couldn't reach. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. The more exotic your gifts, the stronger your alliances. The stronger your alliances, the safer your trade routes became. Suddenly, that ivory tusk or jar of frankincense wasn't just valuable, it was geopolitical currency. But the real game changer was how these goods shaped entire economies. Take the tin trade, a dull metal until you realize bronze, and therefore civilization's tools and weapons couldn't exist without it. Sources were scarce, maybe Afghanistan, possibly Cornwall. Whoever controlled those mines didn't just get rich, they held the keys to military dominance. That's why the Assyrians guarded their trade routes like state secrets, why Hittite kings wrote panic-stricken letters when shipments were delayed. The original arms race wasn't fought with swords but with supply chains, yet the most enduring legacy might be cultural. Every time a luxury item crossed borders, it carried ideas. Egyptian scarabs found in Canaanite tombs, Mesopotamian cylinder seals imitated by Elamite artists. These weren't just objects, they were Trojan horses of influence, smuggling artistic styles, religious symbols, even technological know-how. When a foreign princess married into a royal house with her dowry of exotic goods, she didn't just bring possessions, she brought entire worldviews. The first globalization wasn't powered by treaties but by taste, and that's the ultimate irony. The very items meant to divide elites from commoners, the lapis, the myrrh, the finely wrought gold, became the threads that wove civilizations together. A Babylonian noble's vanity might fund an entire caravan industry, employing hundreds. A pharaoh's obsession with cedar could link shipbuilders from Byblos to artists in Thebes. What began as displays of power ended up creating something far greater, a connected ancient world where the desires of the few reshaped the lives of the many. The next time you see a modern influencer flaunting some imported luxury, remember, they're walking a path first paved 5,000 years ago, when blue stones and fragrant wood changed the world. Centuries before silk ever crossed the steppes of Central Asia, another network of trade routes pulsed with life, the Bronze Age highways where donkeys carried not just goods, but the very building blocks of civilization. Picture this, a caravan of creaking wooden carts rolling out of Mesopotamia, laden with tin and textiles, bound for Anatolia's metal workshops. These weren't just merchants, they were the original tech disruptors, their cargo holds packed with innovations that would reshape societies. The wheel itself, once a revolutionary idea, spread along these very routes, transforming everything from farming to warfare. One day, a potter's wheel in Ur, the next, chariots thundering across battlefields from Egypt to India. What made these exchanges so explosive wasn't just the objects traded, but the knowledge that traveled with them. A Hittite smith might barter for Cypriot copper, but the real prize was the technique to alloy it with Afghan tin into durable bronze. Suddenly, tools lasted longer, plows cut deeper, and weapons became deadlier. This wasn't mere commerce, it was a silent industrial revolution spreading village by village. Even something as simple as a harness design, tweaked by Assyrian traders for better donkey traction, could ripple outward, boosting crop yields across entire regions. The real magic happened at the crossroads. Take the ancient city of Kanesh in Anatolia, where Assyrian merchants lived alongside local Hittites. Their clay letters, thousands discovered in a single archive, reveal a melting pot where business deals doubled as cultural exchanges. A Mesopotamian might adopt Anatolian fashions while teaching cuneiform to his neighbors. Recipes, medicinal herbs, even superstitions hitched rides on these routes. When a drought struck one region, survival might depend on grains shipped from another, creating bonds of interdependence that outlasted wars and dynasties. Perhaps the most unexpected export, social change. As trade flourished, old hierarchies trembled. A savvy merchant in Dilmun could amass wealth rivaling kings, while craftsmen who mastered new techniques gained unprecedented status. Women in Assyrian trading colonies ran businesses independently, their seals authorizing contracts centuries before such rights became common. The constant flow of people and ideas made these hubs surprisingly cosmopolitan places where a traveler from the Indus Valley might debate astronomy with a Babylonian priest over beers. These routes also birthed history's first economic downturns. When tin shipments faltered due to unrest, entire industries stalled. Kings stockpiled metals like modern central banks hoard gold, while merchants hedged bets by diversifying cargoes. The parallels to today's supply chain crises are uncanny, right down to the desperate letters complaining about delayed shipments and rising costs. Yet for all their sophistication, these networks depended on fragile threads. A single collapsed kingdom could sever routes for generations, as happened when the Indus Valley civilization declined. But like resilient roots, new paths always sprouted elsewhere. By the time the famous Silk Road emerged millennia later, it was simply building on a template forged in the Bronze Age, proof that once humanity discovers connection, it never truly forgets. The next time you see a global shipping route on a map, remember, those lines trace back to donkey tracks worn deep by ancient traders who dared to look beyond the horizon. Beneath the sun-scorched hills of Cyprus lay a treasure more valuable than gold, copper, the metal that would fuel the engines of the ancient world. Imagine miners chiseling into rock faces, their hands stained green from the ore that would soon travel thousands of miles to become tools, weapons, and sacred objects. This wasn't just another commodity, it was the lifeblood of progress, the first resource to bind continents in a shared pursuit. From the workshops of Mesopotamia to the palaces of Egypt, copper became the universal currency of innovation, traded in ingots shaped like ox hides, a form so standardized it functioned like ancient bullion. The scale of this trade was staggering. Ships laden with Cypriot copper braved the Mediterranean's capricious waves, their hulls packed with cargo that could transform entire economies. One single wreck discovered off the coast of Turkey held over 10 tons of raw copper, enough to outfit an army with weapons or a city with tools for years. But here's what's truly remarkable. This wasn't just about supply and demand. Copper created the world's first industrial hubs. Cities like Economies on Cyprus mushroomed around smelting furnaces, their streets thick with the smoke of workshops where ore was refined into portable ingots. The entire island became a factory, its economy and identity forever tied to the metal beneath its soil. Labor systems bent to copper's will. Unlike seasonal farming, mining never paused. Tunnels had to be dug, furnaces stoked, and shipments loaded regardless of the time of year. This relentless demand birthed specialized workforces, miners who knew how to follow ore veins, smelters who mastered the alchemy of turning rock into metal, and merchants who navigated the complex logistics of moving heavy cargo across land and sea. Some of history's earliest strikes may have occurred here as workers pushed back against grueling conditions, yet the trade flourished because the rewards were too great to ignore. A single ingot could buy a farmer's yearly harvest, making copper the ultimate motivator for risk and innovation. Copper's true power lay in its ability to forge connections. When Egyptian pharaohs needed bronze for their chariots, they didn't invade Cyprus, they traded. Temple reliefs show envoys presenting copper as diplomatic gifts, a tangible symbol of mutual interest. The Hittites, masters of metallurgy, guarded their copper alloy recipes like state secrets, knowing technical knowledge was as valuable as the metal itself. Even beyond empires, nomadic tribes carried copper trinkets across the steppes, spreading not just goods but metallurgical techniques that would eventually reach the far corners of Eurasia. But like any dependency, this network had vulnerabilities. When drought or unrest disrupted shipments, the effects rippled across civilizations. Archaeologists find frantic letters between kings begging for copper deliveries, their armies paralyzed without fresh supplies. Some cities hoarded stockpiles, while others experimented with inferior local ores, inadvertently driving new technological advances. The lesson was clear: globalization, even in its earliest form, came with both power and peril. The legacy of this trade still gleams in unexpected places. That penny in your pocket, its lineage traces back to those oxhide ingots, the electrical wiring in your walls. A direct descendant of the same conductive properties ancient artisans exploited. Copper didn't just shape the ancient world, it wired humanity's future, proving that sometimes the most ordinary materials can spark the most extraordinary transformations. They called themselves the people of the road, these leather-skinned merchants who spent more time in the saddle than in their own beds. Picture an Assyrian trader named Ashur-nadar, his donkey caravan laden with tin ingots, winding through the mountain passes of Anatolia. Every step was a gamble. Bandits lurked behind boulders, storms could wipe out trails overnight, and local rulers might demand exorbitant taxes at spear point. Yet without these middlemen, the Bronze Age's glittering trade networks would have collapsed like a bridge with no supports. What set these intermediaries apart wasn't just their endurance, but their diplomatic genius. Take the Assyrian merchant colonies in Kanesh, where traders didn't just sell goods, they became cultural chameleons. They learned Hittite customs to negotiate deals, adopted local fashions to build trust, even married into Anatolian families to cement alliances. Their clay letters reveal a world where business and statecraft blurred. One merchant might report back to Assyria on political unrest that could affect tin prices, while another smoothed tensions between rival clans to keep trade routes open. These weren't mere shopkeepers, they were the original corporate spies and crisis negotiators. Phoenician sailors took these risks to another level. Imagine a ship's captain from Tyre steering his cedar-hulled vessel past the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call Gibraltar, into the terrifying unknown of the Atlantic. No maps, no compasses, just the stars and stories of sea monsters. Yet these voyages birthed history's first maritime trade empire, their secret: adaptability. A single Phoenician ship might carry Egyptian glass, Greek pottery, and Spanish silver, swapping cargo at every port like a floating bazaar. Even their famous purple dye, extracted from thousands of crushed sea snails, became more than a product. It was a marketing triumph, so exclusive that Roman emperors would later reserve it for royal robes. The real magic happened in the trading hubs. Places like Ugarit on the Syrian coast became ancient versions of Dubai or Singapore, where scribes recorded transactions in 5 languages and merchants from Crete to Babylon rubbed shoulders in smoke-filled taverns. Here, a Hittite could buy Cypriot copper using Mesopotamian accounting methods, while Egyptian doctors tended to sick sailors with remedies from the Indus Valley. These middlemen didn't just transport goods, they created the world's first multicultural spaces, where ideas flowed as freely as wine. Yet their greatest legacy might be intangible: trust. When a merchant advanced goods on credit to a distant partner, they relied on reputation more than contracts. Broken promises meant exile from tight-knit trading networks, a fate worse than financial ruin. That's why families like the Assyrian Ejubai clan maintained meticulous records across generations, building dynasties of trust that outlasted empires. In an age without credit scores or courts, a merchant's word was his bond, and the penalty for betrayal wasn't just lost gold, it was being erased from the ledger of history. So next time you click Buy Now on some global marketplace, remember the original risk-takers who made it possible. Those ancient middlemen didn't just move merchandise, they moved humanity forward, one perilous journey at a time. Their caravans and ships were the internet cables of antiquity, proving that connection has always been the real currency of civilization. At first glance, the ruins of ancient might look like just another pile of bricks baking under the Mesopotamian sun. But look closer, those crumbling walls tell the story of humanity's greatest social experiment. 5,000 years ago, this was a boomtown, a place where strangers from distant lands crowded into narrow streets, drawn by something revolutionary: opportunity. Unlike farming villages where life followed the seasons, pulsed with relentless energy. Blacksmiths hammered copper from Cyprus into tools, scribes tallied shipments of Afghan Lapis Lazuli, and bakers ground grain imported from far up the Euphrates. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a machine powered by trade, one that would redefine what it meant to be a community. The secret to Ur's rise: geography as destiny. Perched where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met the Persian Gulf, it became nature's perfect warehouse. Ships from the Indus Valley unloaded cargoes of ivory and carnelian, while donkey caravans arrived from Anatolia with silver and tin. But here's the twist: the city didn't just benefit from passing trade, it added value. Local artisans transformed raw materials into luxury goods, turning a riverbank stopover into an indispensable hub. A lump of imported tin became a finely cast statue, increasing tenfold in worth. Suddenly, simply being along the route wasn't enough. You had to offer skills strangers couldn't find elsewhere. This alchemy of trade and talent sparked an urban revolution. As merchants grew wealthy, they needed scribes to track deals, guards to protect warehouses, and builders to erect grand homes. Temples expanded into economic engines, storing surplus grain to stabilize prices during droughts. Even sanitation improved. Archaeologists find intricate drainage systems in Mohenjo-Daro, a city that thrived on Indus Valley trade. These weren't just conveniences, they were necessities for populations too large to sustain through farming alone. For the first time, humans lived cheek by jowl with thousands of unrelated individuals, held together not by kinship, but by shared dependence on commerce. The social effects were profound. In villages, your place was inherited. A farmer's son became a farmer, but cities like birthed social mobility. A clever apprentice could rise from grinding pigments to painting palace frescoes. Women ran taverns and textile workshops, their seals found on business contracts. Immigrants brought new languages, recipes, and gods, forcing neighbors to develop tolerance, or at least pragmatism. The old rules no longer applied. When a drought struck the countryside, desperate farmers flocked to city gates, trading labor for food and swelling urban populations further. Perhaps the most lasting innovation was the city's ability to specialize. One quarter might house metalworkers smelting imported ores, while another hosted perfumers blending Arabian frankincense with local oils. This division of labor meant no single person needed to master every skill. A potter could focus solely on perfecting his craft, knowing others would provide his food, clothes, and tools. Efficiency soared, and with it, artistic and technological breakthroughs. The world's first schools emerged to train scribes for the bureaucracy trade demanded, while standard weights and measures brought consistency to markets. Yet these glittering cities had a dark underside. Wealth gaps yawned wider than their defensive walls. A merchant's villa with frescoed walls might stand steps away from cramped tenements. Slavery flourished as war captives were put to work in workshops, and when trade routes faltered, due to war, climate shifts, or simply changing tastes, entire districts could collapse overnight. The very interdependence that built urban life also made it fragile. Still, the genie couldn't be put back in the bottle. Once people experienced the vibrancy of city life, its markets brimming with exotic goods, its streets alive with gossip in a dozen tongues, few wanted to return to subsistence farming. Trade had done more than move merchandise, it had rewired human aspirations. The city wasn't just a place anymore, it was an idea, one that whispered. Here, even a stranger with nothing but wits and determination could carve out a place in the world. And that idea would echo through every metropolis to come, from ancient Rome to modern Tokyo, proving that commerce doesn't just build economies, it builds the stage on which civilization performs. Before coins jingled in purses or paper money changed hands, value took far stranger forms, like the barley grains piled high in Mesopotamian storehouses. Picture a merchant carefully counting out measures of grain, not for bread but to pay a weaver for linen. This was money in its rawest form, edible, practical, and universally understood. What made barley work wasn't just its usefulness, it was trust. Everyone agreed 10 measures equaled a day's labor, or 5 could buy a clay pot. No government decreed this system. It grew organically from countless transactions, a silent consensus that turned humble grain into the world's first paycheck. But barley had limits. Try stuffing a year's worth of harvest into your belt to buy a donkey, and you'd quickly understand why silver became the next leap forward. In Anatolia, merchants didn't trade bulky ingots, they used delicate rings, small enough to wear on a string around the wrist, need to make a purchase. Just snap off a ring segment. These weren't just pretty trinkets, their purity and weight were fiercely standardized. Archaeologists find rings across the ancient Near East with nearly identical dimensions, proof of an informal but rigorous system. The real innovation, portability. A fistful of rings could buy a caravan's worth of goods, collapsing an entire economy into something you could carry. Then came the real game changer, shells. Not just any shells, but the glossy Cowry shells harvested from the Indian Ocean. These tiny treasures spread like wildfire from the Indus Valley to Shang Dynasty China. Their appeal was genius, durable, impossible to counterfeit, and rare enough to hold value. But here's what's fascinating, cowries weren't just money. They were status symbols, ritual objects, even early medical charms. A single shell could buy a meal in one context or seal a marriage alliance in another. This duality, practical and sacred, made them the perfect bridge between mundane trade and deeper social bonds. The true power of these proto-currencies lay in their flexibility. A Hittite trader might accept silver by weight one day and Baltic amber beads the next, depending on whose hands he shook. Local markets developed their own microeconomies. Egyptian scribes recorded deals in Deben weights of copper, while Mesopotamians preferred shekels of barley. Yet despite this chaos, a remarkable thing happened. Cross-cultural exchange rates emerged. A letter from Ugarit casually mentions converting Canaanite silver to Egyptian gold at a set ratio, proving that even without central banks, ancient financiers had a keen sense of global markets. What's often overlooked is how these systems democratized trade. Unlike later coinage stamped with kings' faces, early money belonged to everyone. A farmer could save barley for lean years, a potter hoard silver rings for his daughter's dowry. Temples acted as proto-banks, storing wealth and even issuing receipts that functioned like checks. The system wasn't perfect, grain spoiled, silver got clipped, but it gave ordinary people a tool kings couldn't fully control. When rulers eventually minted coins, they weren't inventing money. They were hijacking a grassroots innovation that had already reshaped the world, the lesson buried in these ancient transactions. Real economic power doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it bubbles up from the collective ingenuity of countless individuals, each searching for a fair way to exchange the work of their hands. The next time you tap your phone to pay for coffee, remember, you're part of a chain that stretches back to dusty market stalls where value wasn't decreed but discovered, one barley measure at a time. The cedar forests of Lebanon once stood as the ultimate prize, towering trees so coveted that their scent alone could spark wars. When Sargon of Akkad, history's first empire builder, demanded shipments of this wood of the gods, he wasn't just ordering construction materials. He was testing the limits of power. The moment Lebanese cities resisted, refusing to fell their sacred groves for foreign kings, the Akkadians did something revolutionary. They weaponized trade itself. No invading armies, no burning of cities, just a royal decree banning all Akkadian silver from reaching Lebanese ports. Suddenly, merchants who'd grown rich off this exchange found their livelihood strangling. This wasn't just an embargo, it was economic warfare waged 4,000 years before the term existed. What makes these early trade wars so startling is their sophistication. The Hittites didn't just blockade enemies, they flooded rival markets with cheap copper to bankrupt local smiths. Egyptian pharaohs used Nile grain as leverage, cutting shipments to vassal cities that wavered in loyalty. One clay tablet from Mari records a desperate king pleading for the embargo on his tin imports to lift, offering political concessions in exchange. The language could have been lifted from modern trade disputes. Why do you treat me as an enemy? Without tin, my people cannot make bronze, and without bronze, we cannot defend ourselves. But the real masterstroke came in how these sanctions targeted psychology as much as economics. When Assyrian merchants were caught smuggling iron, a technology more guarded than nuclear secrets today, their punishment wasn't execution, but humiliation. They were paraded through streets wearing donkey collars, a warning that violated trade laws eroded not just wealth, but dignity. Kings understood that commerce relied on trust, and breaking the rules meant exile from the delicate web of connections that made civilization possible. The most brutal sanctions, though, were environmental. At Kanish, archaeologists found entire merchant quarters burned not by invaders, but by their own hands. When political winds shifted, traders torched their archives rather than let rivals access their client lists. This scorched earth tactic echoes in today's data wars, where corporations would rather destroy intellectual property than let competitors benefit. Yet for all their ruthlessness, these ancient trade wars had an unexpected upside. They forced innovation. When the Sea Peoples disrupted Mediterranean tin routes, smiths from Greece to Palestine experimented with local alloys, accidentally improving metalworking. A blocked spice route might lead sailors to discover new lands, just as Phoenicians ventured beyond Gibraltar when Egyptian markets closed. The pattern holds a lesson we're still grappling with. Every act of economic aggression plants seeds for unforeseen breakthroughs. Perhaps the most poignant artifact is a broken tablet from Ugarit, its last words scratched hastily as invaders approached. The enemy ships are here, the silver is gone, the copper is gone. It's a reminder that no trade network, no matter how vast, survives forever. But the rules first etched in these ancient conflicts, that commerce can be both a lifeline and a weapon, still shape every tariff, every embargo, every sanctions list today. The battlegrounds have changed, but the game remains the same. Buried in the ruins of ancient archaeologists found something that shouldn't have been there. A tiny, square stamp seal carved with the image of a humped bull and strange symbols. At first glance, it might seem insignificant, but this small artifact was a smoking gun. The seal came from Harappa, a city over 1,500 miles away in the Indus Valley, and its discovery shattered old assumptions about how far ancient trade networks truly stretched. Here was proof that 4,000 years ago, merchants from Mesopotamia weren't just trading with their neighbors, they were striking deals across distances that would have seemed unimaginable to most people of their time. What's astonishing is what these seals reveal about the nature of this trade. Unlike the Assyrian caravans hauling bulk metals or the Egyptian shipments of grain, the Indus connection was built on something far more delicate: luxury. Harappan seals, made from polished steatite and etched with intricate animal motifs, weren't just receipts, they were trademarks, guaranteeing the quality of goods like fine cotton textiles or rare carnelian beads. Imagine a Sumerian noble unwrapping a bundle stamped with that bull seal, knowing it contained fabric so sheer it was called woven wind, or beads so precisely drilled they seemed magical. This wasn't commerce, it was branding, a promise of craftsmanship that transcended language barriers. But the real mystery lies in how these exchanges functioned. Unlike Mesopotamia's detailed contracts or Egypt's royal monopolies, the Indus Valley left no deciphered records of tariffs or treaties. Their seals, found as far away as Oman and Babylon, hint at a system built on silent understanding rather than written agreements. Perhaps deals were brokered through intermediaries in Meluha, the Mesopotamian name for the Indus region, where traders spoke both languages and knew both cultures. Or maybe goods moved in stages, passed like a baton from one middleman to another, each taking a cut until that carnelian bead or ivory comb reached its final buyer. The impact went both ways. Indus cities, meticulously planned with grid streets and advanced drainage, suddenly featured Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals in their markets. Harappan potters began mimicking designs from distant while Mesopotamian scribes listed Meluhan villages among their trading partners, even more telling. The Indus Valley adopted the Mesopotamian system of weights, but with a twist. They standardized their own units, slightly heavier than their Western counterparts, as if to assert economic independence. This wasn't just borrowing, it was adaptation, a dialogue between civilizations conducted through balance scales and cargo holds. Yet the most profound exchange might have been invisible. When Indus cotton reached Sumer, it revolutionized clothing in a region reliant on wool. When Mesopotamian lunar calendar concepts drifted east, they influenced Harappan timekeeping. And somewhere along these routes, the idea of the wheel, possibly born in Mesopotamia, transformed Indus Valley transportation. The trade in goods became a trade in ideas, each shipment carrying not just objects, but the seeds of innovation. Then, around 1900 BC, the seals stop appearing. The Indus cities decline, their trade networks withering as mysteriously as they began. Was it climate change? Shifting river courses, or did rising powers elsewhere reroute the economic currents? Whatever the cause, the legacy of this connection endures. Those scattered seals are more than artifacts. they're reminders that globalization isn't a modern invention, but an ancient impulse as old as humanity's first longing for something beautiful, rare, and just beyond the horizon. Egypt's trade network stretched like golden threads across the ancient world, each strand pulsing with wealth and ambition. Nowhere was this more visible than in the legendary expedition Queen Hatshepsut launched to the mysterious land of Punt. Carved reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show towering ships returning with treasures that seemed plucked from dreams, ebony logs taller than men, live myrrh trees with roots carefully packed in baskets, even exotic animals like baboons and cheetahs. But this wasn't just a shopping trip for luxury goods. Every item served a calculated purpose. The myrrh became sacred incense for temples, its smoke carrying prayers to the gods. Ebony transformed into statues of deities, their dark wood gleaming against gold leaf. Even the animals had roles, some as royal pets, others as living symbols of Egypt's dominion over distant lands. What made these exchanges so brilliant was how they blurred commerce and theater. When Hatshepsut's ships sailed home, they didn't slip quietly into dock. The return became a spectacle, with goods paraded before cheering crowds to the beat of drums. Temple walls immortalized the event, showing Puntite chiefs bowing before the pharaoh, a carefully staged message that foreign rulers willingly submitted to Egypt's might. The gold, ivory, and incense weren't just commodities, they were props in a grand performance of power. Even the route to Punt was shrouded in mystery, its location a state secret that kept competitors at bay. This wasn't trade as we know it, it was economic theater, where every transaction strengthened the illusion of divine favor surrounding Egypt's throne. Yet behind the pageantry lay ruthless economic strategy. Take Nubian gold. Egypt didn't just trade for it, they conquered the mines. Fortresses guarded the desert routes where donkeys carried gold dust northward, each grain destined to gild temple walls or adorn royal crowns. When Levantine cities like Byblos supplied cedar for Egypt's navy, the deals came with strings attached, military protection in exchange for favorable rates. Pharaohs understood that controlling trade meant controlling destiny. A single shipment of grain to Hittite lands during famine could buy loyalty for generations, while cutting off copper supplies to rebellious vassals brought them to their knees without drawing a sword. The genius of Egypt's system was its flexibility. Unlike rigid command economies, they adapted to local conditions. In Nubia, they established permanent mining towns. With the elusive Puntites, they traded seasonally when monsoon winds allowed safe passage. For Aegean merchants bringing olive oil and pottery, they set up free trade zones in Nile Delta ports. This pragmatic approach created a commercial empire that lasted millennia, weathering droughts, invasions, and shifting alliances. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was cultural. Egyptian blue faience beads became status symbols from Britain to China. The iconic Eye of Horus amulet traveled on trade routes, evolving into the modern pharmacist symbol. Even something as simple as the domesticated cat, originally prized for protecting grain stores, spread globally thanks to Egypt's commercial connections. The pharaohs might have seen trade as a tool of propaganda, but its unintended consequences shaped the world far beyond their borders. Beneath the gold and grandeur, Egypt's true innovation was recognizing that commerce could build more than wealth, it could build influence. Every traded good carried Egyptian ideas, aesthetics, and authority to distant shores. When modern nations use economic aid or trade sanctions as diplomatic tools, they're walking a path first paved by ancient merchants sailing the Nile with holds full of Nubian gold and dreams of empire. Up along the windswept shores of the Baltic, fishermen wading through icy waters would sometimes spot golden treasures glinting beneath the waves, chunks of amber washed ashore after centuries adrift. To them, it was just pretty stone, good for carving trinkets or burning as fragrant incense. But 1,000 miles south, this gold of the north sparked fantasies in the courts of pharaohs and emperors. By the time Baltic amber reached the Mediterranean, a single bead could trade for its weight in silver, becoming one of history's first truly global luxury items. What began as driftwood transformed by time became a catalyst for connections between worlds that barely knew each other existed. The journey of a single piece of amber tells the story. Harvested by daring divers off Scandinavia's coast, it might pass through the hands of Germanic traders who strung beads onto iron wires to create gleaming necklaces. From there, Celtic merchants carried it south along river routes, trading it for Italian wine at bustling Danube crossings. By the time it reached Rome, that same nugget could adorn a senator's wife as a pendant, its inclusions of ancient insects or leaves whispered to hold magical properties. Amber wasn't just traded, it was transformed, each culture adding value through craftsmanship and myth. The Greeks believed it was solidified sunlight, the Egyptians used it in mummification rituals, and Chinese physicians prescribed powdered amber as a cure for heartache. What powered this network wasn't just beauty, but sheer logistics. Unlike bulky metals or fragile glass, amber was lightweight and nearly indestructible, perfect for long hauls. The routes it traveled became Europe's first economic arteries, with way stations evolving into towns like today's Rocklaw, where amber deposits still surface in construction sites. Archaeologists find Baltic amber in Mycenaean tombs from 1600 BCE, and even King Tut's burial chamber held pieces that likely began as resin dripping from prehistoric Scandinavian pines. The scale was staggering. At the peak of Roman demand, an estimated 2,000 pounds of raw amber moved south annually, funding entire coastal communities in the Baltic. But here's what's fascinating: amber did more than enrich traders. It forced technological leaps. To transport it safely, Celtic craftsmen invented wooden crates lined with wool, an early version of modern packaging. Roman engineers improved roads along the so-called amber route from Carnuntum to the Baltic, bridges and all, creating infrastructure that outlasted the empire itself. Even piracy got a boost as raiders like the Veneti tribe controlled key river passages, demanding tolls in amber rather than coin. The stone became so synonymous with wealth that Viking sagas describe warriors wearing amber amulets into battle, believing its electrostatic properties could ward off evil. The true legacy of these routes lies in their unpredictability. A Norse trader might swap amber for Arabian silver in Constantinople, not realizing that silver came from mines near Mecca, connecting a Baltic fisherman's catch to Islamic pilgrimages halfway across the world. When Polish nobles later hoarded amber to boost its rarity, they inadvertently spurred Columbus-era explorers to seek new trade routes, proving how ancient networks shaped even the age of discovery. That humble chunk of fossilized resin did more than adorn necks. It wove together economies, sparked innovations, and reminded humanity that value isn't inherent. It's created by the stories we tell and the hands something passes through on its way from sea to palace. In the shadow of Mesopotamia's towering ziggurats, something unexpected hummed alongside the chanting of priests, the clink of weights and measures, the scratch of stylus on clay. These temples weren't just houses of worship, they were the Wall Street and Federal Reserve of their time. Take the great temple of Enlil at Nippur. Its storerooms bulged not just with offerings, but with loans of barley and silver, its scribes keeping meticulous records of who owed what to whom. Gods didn't just demand devotion, they demanded good credit. A merchant swearing an oath by Shamash wasn't merely seeking divine favor. He was leveraging the sun god's reputation as an enforcer of justice to reassure his trading partner. The system was ingenious. Temples had the three things trade needed most: security, stability, and sanctity. Their thick walls guarded wealth better than any merchant's home. Their calendars marked the rhythms of festivals and trade fairs, turning holy days into market days, and their gods, they were the ultimate guarantors. A contract sealed in the name of Ishtar carried more weight than a king's decree, because while rulers could be overthrown, the gods were eternal. Archaeologists find lone tablets with phrases like "repay before the face of Marduk" or "bear his wrath," a Bronze Age version of "or face the consequences." Greek temples took this even further. Walk through the ruins of Delphi and you'll find something startling: not just altars, but hundreds of treasury buildings lining the sacred way. These weren't shrines, they were vaults where city-states stored their surplus, protected by Apollo's prestige. Pilgrims coming to consult the oracle would change their foreign currency into temple standard silver, funding the sanctuary while lubricating regional trade. The Parthenon itself functioned as Athens' central bank, its goddess Athena's colossal statue surrounded by the city's financial reserves. But the real power lay in how these sacred economies bridged cultures. Phoenician traders making offerings at Egyptian temples gained access to local networks. Babylonian priests issued letters of credit honored from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Even acts that seemed purely religious, like donating a tenth of one's harvest, functioned as primitive insurance systems, with temples redistributing food during famines to maintain social stability. The legacy of this fusion still lingers. Modern banking terms like sterling, originally Easterling coins minted by Easter temples, or pecuniary, from Latin pecus, meaning cattle once offered at shrines, carry echoes of these sacred marketplaces. When medieval cathedrals hosted fairs or Islamic wax-funded trade caravans, they were continuing a tradition as old as civilization itself, that wherever people gather to seek the divine, they'll inevitably discover the power of mutual exchange. The Mediterranean wasn't just a body of water to the ancients, it was a high-stakes casino where merchants gambled fortunes on the roll of the waves. Picture a Phoenician ship, its cedar hull groaning under the weight of Canaanite wine jars and crates of Tyrian purple dye, each drop of which required thousands of crushed sea snails. One storm, one wrong turn past Crete's treacherous coasts, and an empire's worth of wealth could vanish beneath the waves. That's exactly what happened to the Uluburun shipwreck off Turkey's coast, a time capsule of Bronze Age trade now resting on the seabed. Among its ruins, 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, ebony logs from Africa, even Baltic amber beads, proof that a single vessel could link continents in a way no land caravan ever could. What made sea trade so dangerous and so lucrative was its sheer scale. A single successful voyage could net profits that would take overland caravans a lifetime to match. The Phoenicians didn't just transport goods, they moved entire industries. Their ships carried not just finished glass beads from Egypt, but raw silica and soda ash for workshops in Greece to melt down locally. This wasn't just shipping, it was the ancient equivalent of outsourcing, creating dependencies that spanned the Mediterranean. A Mycenaean potter might rely on Phoenician middlemen for Egyptian cobalt to achieve his signature blue glaze, while an Iberian chieftain's status hinged on steady shipments of Levantine wine. The real game changer was navigation technology. Forget compasses or charts, Phoenician pilots used something far more ingenious: lead-weighted depth lines coated in tallow. By dropping these to the seabed, they could taste the bottom, sand, shell, or mud, and recognize coastal zones like a sommelier identifies wine. At night, they steered by the North Star, which they called the Phoenician Star, keeping it aligned with specific masthead carvings. These weren't just sailors, they were human GPS systems. their knowledge so valuable that Greek myths claimed Poseidon himself paid Phoenicians to teach navigation secrets. But the risks were as vast as the rewards. Pirates lurked in narrow straits like the Lipari Islands, where jagged rocks forced ships into ambush zones. A single season's piracy could collapse entire trade networks. Letters from Ugarit begged for naval escorts as merchants refused to sail. Even the weather played tricks. The Mediterranean's sudden summer storms could sink an overloaded vessel in minutes, as the Uluburan captain learned too late. His ship went down with a king's ransom, ivory, ostrich eggs, even a gold scarab inscribed with Queen Nefertiti's name, a diplomatic gift that never reached its destination. Yet for all its dangers, maritime trade had an unexpected democratizing effect. Unlike land routes controlled by empires, the sea was a free-for-all. A savvy Cypriot merchant could undercut Hittite royal monopolies by shipping copper directly to Aegean smiths. Shipwrecks reveal egalitarian cargo's luxury, goods nestled beside humble fish sauce amphorae, proof that profit trumped class distinctions. The sea also bred strange partnerships, Egyptian sailors hiring Nubian mercenaries to guard shipments, or Mycenaean nobles investing in Phoenician voyages despite political tensions. The legacy of these ancient mariners still washes ashore today. Modern divers off Malta find Phoenician anchor stones repurposed as fishing weights centuries later. Genetic studies show Lebanese traders left their mark not just in cargo holds, but in the DNA of coastal communities from Sicily to Sardinia. Most telling. The word risk itself comes from the early Italian risicare, meaning to dare, a fitting tribute to those who first dared to trade across the unpredictable sea. Every container ship tracing their routes today sails in the wake of those who understood the oldest rule of commerce. Fortune favors the bold, but the waves show no mercy. Buried beneath the dust of ancient marketplaces, archaeologists keep finding them small stone discs no larger than a plum, meticulously carved with precise grooves. These unassuming objects might seem insignificant, but they were the silent guardians of fairness in a world where trust was as fragile as a clay tablet in the sun. Meet the Mesopotamian shekel weight, history's first universal currency of trust, not a coin, not a bill, but a carefully measured chunk of stone that could bridge languages, cultures, and empires. The genius of these weights lay in their simplicity. A merchant in Babylon could place a lump of silver on one side of a balanced scale, a shekel stone on the other, and instantly know its value. No haggling, no guesswork. But here's what's remarkable. That same weight worked just as reliably in a Cretan marketplace or an Assyrian trading post hundreds of miles away. This wasn't just convenience, it was revolutionary. For the first time, strangers who worshipped different gods and spoke unintelligible languages could trade with confidence because the shekel spoke a tongue everyone understood: mathematics. Creating these standards demanded astonishing precision. Craftsmen in Dilmun, modern Bahrain, specialized in cutting weights from gleaming diorite, a stone so hard it took diamond dust to polish. Surviving examples vary by less than half a gram across centuries, proof of meticulous quality control. Temples acted as living calibration labs with master weights kept under lock and key. When disputes arose, merchants could bring their personal weights to be tested against these sacred standards, much like today's scales get certified by government bureaus. The system's real power emerged in its adaptability. The basic shekel, about 8.3 grams, could be divided into 24 gerahs for small purchases or multiplied into 60 shekel minas for bulk goods. Imagine a Bronze Age merchant smiling as he counted out 12 gerah weights for a loaf of bread, then stacking mina stones to weigh out enough copper for a ship's anchor. This scalability turned chaotic bazaars into orderly markets, where everything from a pinch of saffron to a ton of timber could be fairly priced. But weights did more than enable trade, they shaped societies. When the Code of Hammurabi set fines in silver shekels, or when Egyptian tax collectors demanded grain measured to the exact deben, they were building something radical: the rule of law. No longer could the powerful simply take what they wanted. Now everything had a measurable value, from a day's labor to a stolen goat. Even justice became quantifiable. Hammurabi's laws prescribed 60 shekels for a broken bone, half that for a knocked-out tooth. The legacy of these ancient standards still weighs on us today. The word shekel survives in modern Hebrew currency, while the British pound originally referred to a pound of silver sterling. More profoundly, the idea that fairness can be measured, that a society thrives when everyone agrees on the rules, was forged in those dusty market stalls. So next time you glance at a grocery store scale or check the specs on a new phone, remember, you're participating in a 4,000-year-old tradition, one that began when a merchant first placed a stone on a balance and declared, "This much and no less." Imagine a bustling Assyrian trading post where a Phoenician merchant argues with a Hittite buyer over the price of cedar logs, without a single word of each other's native tongue. This chaotic scene was the birthplace of linguistic revolution, where the practical demands of commerce forged new ways to communicate across cultures. The solution: Aramaic, a once obscure Semitic language that rose to dominate the ancient Near East, not through conquest but through the ledger books of merchants. Its ascent mirrors how English became today's global language, not by royal decree, but because traders from Bombay to Boston found it the most useful tool for sealing deals. The magic of Aramaic lay in its simplicity. Unlike the intricate cuneiform of Mesopotamia or hieroglyphics lining Egyptian temples, its alphabet had just 22 easy-to-learn letters, scratched quickly on parchment or clay. Perfect for drafting contracts on the fly or shouting prices across crowded markets. As caravans fanned out from Damascus to the edges of Persia, Aramaic hitched a ride, becoming the default tongue for everything from tax receipts to diplomatic treaties. Even empires that resisted foreign rule, like the Jews under Babylonian captivity, adopted it for daily life because commerce left no choice. Business, then as now, waits for no one to master a dead language. But trade's influence on language went deeper than vocabulary. It reshaped how people thought. The very concept of loanwords took on literal meaning when Akkadian terms for interest rates slipped into Hebrew, or when Phoenician shipping jargon infected Greek harbor slang. Merchants didn't just borrow words, they remixed them, creating hybrid dialects like the pidgin used in Cyprus copper mines, where foremen shouted commands blending Anatolian, Greek, and Semitic fragments. These linguistic mashups were the ancient equivalent of today's business jargon: efficient, adaptable, and occasionally baffling to outsiders. Writing systems evolved under trade's pressure too. Ugaritic scribes, tired of carving cumbersome cuneiform for ship manifests, invented the world's first alphabet, not to preserve poetry, but to track olive oil shipments faster. The Phoenicians later streamlined this into a script so practical that it birthed nearly every modern alphabet, from Greek to Arabic. Even the humble receipt played its part. Early Aramaic contracts developed standardized phrases before witnesses, free of claims, that became the boilerplate language of law for centuries. The ripple effects touched even sacred spaces. When Persian kings needed to communicate with far-flung subjects, they used Aramaic for imperial edicts, spreading it as far as India. Jesus likely preached in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because 7 centuries of commerce had made it the people's tongue. Today's global English dominance follows the same blueprint: a language that spread first through trade manuals and shipping notices, long before it appeared in literature or law. The lesson buried in these ancient marketplaces, that trade doesn't just transport spices and silk, it carries the building blocks of culture itself. Every time we say check from Persian, Shah via Arabic traders, or sugar from Sanskrit shakara through Mediterranean merchants, we're speaking the legacy of deals struck millennia ago. The next time you effortlessly switch to English with a foreign client, remember, you're walking a path first paved by Bronze Age salesmen who knew that the best language for business isn't the most poetic, but the one that gets the deal done. In the sun-baked courtyards of Mesopotamian cities, workers lined up not for wages of silver, but for their daily ration of beer, thick, nutritious, and slightly sour. This wasn't just a drink, it was liquid currency, brewed from the very grains that fueled civilization's first economic boom. Barley, once a humble staple grown along the Tigris and Euphrates, became the backbone of trade networks stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. A single transaction tablet from records a shipment of 5,000 liters of beer sent to workers building a temple, proof that even the grandest monuments of antiquity were raised on the promise of a frothy reward. But beer was just the beginning. Across the ancient world, food transformed from mere sustenance into a commodity that could make or break empires. Take Egyptian bread, baked in over 100 varieties, from simple flat loaves to honey-sweetened cakes reserved for festivals. When pharaohs needed to feed armies or reward laborers, they didn't mint coins, they opened granaries. The Nile's predictable floods created such surplus that Egypt became the breadbasket of the Bronze Age, exporting wheat to drought-stricken neighbors in exchange for timber, gold, and loyalty. A single shipment of grain could buy a Hittite king's allegiance during famine, proving that bread wasn't just power, it was diplomacy. The real revolution came when crops themselves became trade goods. Emma wheat, first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, traveled with merchants to the Nile Delta, where it thrived in the rich silt. Farmers who once relied on wild grasses suddenly had access to high-yield strains, turning subsistence plots into commercial enterprises. Archaeologists find Mesopotamian-style plows in the Indus Valley and Egyptian barley in Greek ruins, evidence of an agricultural exchange so profound it reshaped dinner tables across continents. Even the humblest ingredients became global sensations. Sesame oil from Assyria flavored Levantine stews, while dates from Mesopotamia sweetened Cretan desserts. This exchange wasn't just about taste, it altered the very landscape. To meet demand, terraces were carved into Mediterranean hillsides for olive groves, and irrigation canals snaked through deserts to water cash crops. In Anatolia, entire villages specialized in honey production, while Cypriot farmers ripped up native plants to cultivate grapes for wine exports. The first monocultures emerged not by accident, but by design, as traders sought consistency in every amphora of oil or sack of flour. Yet the most surprising legacy might be cultural. When Mesopotamian beer met Egyptian bread in a Babylonian tavern, or when Phoenician sailors introduced figs to North Africa, they weren't just swapping recipes, they were creating fusion cuisines millennia before the term existed. A Hittite soldier stationed in Canaan might develop a taste for chickpeas, carrying them home to Anatolia where they'd become a staple. The spice trade didn't just fill pantries, it rewired palates, turning local delicacies into universal cravings. The next time you sip a beer or bite into a slice of bread, remember, you're tasting the oldest global network of all. Those ancient farmers and merchants didn't just feed their neighbors, they planted the seeds of a connected world, one harvest at a time. Deep in the mountains of Anatolia, a Hittite metalsmith might have guarded his workshop like a fortress, but the secret of bronze was already slipping through his fingers. The alchemy that transformed copper and tin into this revolutionary alloy didn't stay locked in one kingdom for long. Trade routes became the original internet, transmitting not just goods, but the very know-how that reshaped civilizations. A single merchant caravan could carry more than spices and textiles. Tucked between baskets of saffron and bolts of linen were the unspoken lessons of countless artisans, passed from hand to hand across continents. Take the humble pottery wheel. Invented in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, it seemed like a local breakthrough until traders carried the concept to the Indus Valley, where potters adapted it to their own clays and designs. By the time it reached Egypt, the design had evolved further, now powered by foot pedals to free both hands for shaping. This wasn't just imitation, it was innovation through exchange, each culture adding its own improvements like links in a chain. A similar story unfolded with glassblowing, born in the workshops of Phoenicia. What began as a way to mimic precious stones like Lapis Lazuli soon spread to Alexandria, where artisans added vibrant mineral dyes, creating a rainbow of trade goods that would eventually dazzle Rome's elite. The real game changer was bronze, though. Picture a Cypriot copper miner bartering with an Afghan tin trader at a bustling Mesopotamian market. Their deal didn't just swap raw materials, it accidentally fused two distant technologies. The miner's knowledge of smelting met the trader's expertise in alloy ratios, sparking breakthroughs neither could have achieved alone. Soon, Hittite armorers were experimenting with new mixtures, Mycenaean swordsmiths refined casting techniques, and Shang dynasty artisans crafted ritual vessels of unparalleled sophistication. The alloy became so vital that when tin sources dried up due to piracy or politics, entire regions slid into technological regression, proof that trade networks were the invisible scaffolding holding up progress. But the most unexpected transfers weren't always physical. Babylonian astronomers tracking celestial cycles for harvest festivals found their star charts adapted by Phoenician navigators to steer ships at night. Egyptian medical papyri, traded as curiosities, influenced Greek physicians centuries later. Even something as mundane as harness designs for oxen spread from Assyrian farms to Celtic villages, boosting agricultural yields across Europe. The ancient world's greatest inventions rarely had a single birthplace. They were patchwork masterpieces, stitched together across borders and generations. Perhaps the most telling artifacts are the recipe tablets found from Babylon to Hattusa. These detailed instructions for everything from metal alloys to perfumes weren't guarded like state secrets. They were copied, translated, and traded like any other commodity. A single tablet might list ingredients from 5 different regions, acknowledging no borders between their knowledge and ours. In an age before patents or copyrights, innovation thrived precisely because it flowed as freely as the rivers that carried trade boats. The next time you use a technology whose origins span multiple countries, remember, you're holding a legacy forged not in isolation, but in the ancient marketplace's relentless, borderless exchange. Among the thousands of Assyrian clay tablets detailing business deals, one name stands out: Ahaha, a merchant who didn't just dabble in trade but commanded a textile empire stretching from Anatolia to Babylon. Her seal appears on contracts for shipments of wool so vast they required entire caravans, and her meticulous records reveal a mind sharper than any accountant's. But here's what's revolutionary: Ahaha wasn't an anomaly. Across the ancient world, women weren't just passive bystanders in markets. They were brokers, lenders, and innovators in economies often assumed to be male-dominated. Take the bustling quays of Phoenician cities where women ran dye workshops producing the famed Tyrian purple. The process, stinking vats of rotting shellfish, precise temperature control, was no small feat, yet female artisans guarded these techniques like state secrets, passing them down through generations. Over in Mesopotamia, temple archives list female brewers like Kubaba, who supplied beer to construction crews building ziggurats, her name etched alongside male suppliers with no distinction in status or pay. Even in the rigid hierarchies of Egypt, women like the merchant Hekenaket penned letters haggling over linen prices with the same shrewdness as any male counterpart. The real surprise lies in finance. Babylonian marriage contracts often included clauses allowing wives to independently manage their dowries as investment capital. A tablet from Sippar shows a widow named Nidentu loaning silver at interest to fund a trading voyage, her returns meticulously recorded in cuneiform. In Assyrian trade colonies, women like Ahaha didn't just sell goods, they extended credit, negotiated tariffs, and even sued defaulters in courts. Their seals, pressed into clay like notarized signatures, carried the same legal weight as men's. What enabled this economic agency? Necessity, for one. With husbands often away on caravan routes for years, women managed households as de facto CEOs, balancing ledgers, settling debts, and reinvesting profits. But culture played a role too. In societies where trade was the lifeblood, pragmatism often overrode prejudice. A Sumerian proverb put it bluntly: whether the hand is a man's or a woman's, if it brings silver, it is a wise hand. Yet their legacy extends beyond balance sheets. When Ahaha imported Anatolian wool dyes, she didn't just enrich herself, she introduced new colors to Assyrian fashions. A Hittite businesswoman trading Cypriot copper might inadvertently spread metallurgy tricks to local smiths. These women were cultural conduits, their transactions weaving together tastes, technologies, and traditions across borders. The next time someone claims ancient economies were simple or one-dimensional, point them to the clay tablets where women's seals still speak, proof that commerce has always been more diverse and more dynamic than we imagined. Beneath the gleaming temples and bustling markets of the ancient world ran a current of suffering chains clinking in time with the rhythm of commerce. In Mesopotamia, the same cuneiform tablets that recorded loans of silver and shipments of grain also listed human beings alongside livestock and tools, their prices calculated to the shekel. A strong young man might fetch 20 silver pieces, less than a fine donkey but more than a ton of barley. This was trade's grim underbelly, where prosperity for some was built on the backs of countless others. The origins of slavery were often shockingly mundane. Debt turned farmers into property when failed harvests forced them to pledge their families as collateral. A single bad season could reduce a freeborn villager to a laborer in shackles, grinding grain under the watchful eyes of temple overseers. War, however, was the great engine of human misery. Victors like the Akkadian king Sargon didn't just plunder cities, they marched entire populations into bondage. One tablet from Lagash describes the aftermath of a conquest: 8,000 men, women, and children driven like cattle to dig canals and haul bricks for their conquerors' monuments. Egypt's turquoise mines in the Seine reveal slavery's brutal efficiency. Workers toiled in suffocating tunnels, their skeletal remains showing fractures from cave-ins and lung tissue blackened by centuries of dust. Yet these weren't anonymous drones. Archaeologists find crude inscriptions scratched into quarry walls, prayers to gods and curses against overseers. Even in bondage, humanity persisted. Similarly, the silver mines of Laurion in Greece fueled Athens' golden age with the labor of thousands, their lives measured in ore extracted before they collapsed from exhaustion or lead poisoning. What's rarely acknowledged is how tightly slavery intertwined with legitimate trade. Phoenician ships carried not just amber and ivory, but human cargo captives from Mediterranean raids sold to Greek aristocrats or Assyrian officials. The Hittites traded slaves for horses with nomadic tribes, creating a grim currency that crossed cultures. Even seemingly benign goods like olive oil or wine sometimes traveled from field to market on backs bent under whips. Yet resistance flickered constantly. Runaway slave notices survive on Egyptian papyri, offering rewards for the return of weavers or field hands. Mesopotamian legal codes prescribed harsh punishments for assisting escapees, proving the system's fragility. Some of history's first recorded strikes occurred in Babylon, where temple slaves downed tools until rations improved. The line between slave and free was more porous than we imagine. Skilled captives might rise to oversee estates, while debt slaves could buy their freedom after years of service. The legacy of this system stains more than ancient records. Modern supply chains still grapple with exploitation hidden behind glossy packaging, proving that the moral calculus of trade remains unfinished. Those clay tablets listing human lives alongside sacks of wheat challenge us to ask, when we admire the grandeur of antiquity, whose sweat and suffering are we overlooking? The answer might make us reconsider the true cost of civilization's glittering achievements. The bustling ports of Ugarit fell silent first, no more creak of ships unloading Cypriot copper or donkeys braying under loads of Egyptian grain. Then the clay tablets grew frantic, one from the king of Elashia begging for emergency grain shipments. The enemy's ships are already here, my cities are burned. Within a generation, the glittering network connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean snapped like a frayed rope, plunging the Mediterranean world into a darkness that would last centuries. This wasn't just a bad season for merchants, it was the late Bronze Age collapse, where interdependent empires discovered that trade routes were both their lifeblood and their Achilles heel. At the heart of this catastrophe lay a paradox: the very connections that made kingdoms strong also made them vulnerable. Take the Hittites, masters of Anatolia. Their empire depended on steady grain imports from Egypt to feed populations that had outgrown local harvests. When drought struck the Nile and Pharaoh Merneptah halted shipments, Hittite cities starved despite their military might. Similarly, Mycenaean Greece's famed palaces relied on tin from as far as Afghanistan to maintain their bronze weaponry. When piracy and unrest severed those supply lines, their smiths suddenly couldn't forge so much as a plowshare, much less swords to defend against invaders. Archaeologists now see the collapse as history's first perfect storm. Climate data reveals prolonged droughts that turned fertile plains to dust, forcing desperate migrations. Earthquakes shattered cities along the same trade corridors that once enriched them, but the death blow came from interdependence like dominoes. The failure of one node strained the entire system. A shipwreck off Turkey tells the tale. Its cargo of Cypriot copper, Baltic amber, and Egyptian ebony became worthless when there were no more courts to buy luxuries, no more armies needing bronze. Parallels to today's globalized world are unnerving. Modern supply chains stretch even farther than Bronze Age ones, with microchips crossing oceans as routinely as tin once crossed deserts. When the Suez Canal clogged in 2021, it triggered delays that would have felt familiar to a Ugaristan merchant watching pirate ships blockade his harbor. Pandemic-era shortages revealed how reliant we are on far-flung factories and shipping lanes, just as the ancient world relied on intact trade routes for essentials like tin and grain. Yet the collapse also holds unexpected hope. Amid the ruins, survivors adapted. Ironworking, once a curiosity, flourished as tin for bronze grew scarce. Alphabet script simpler than cuneiform emerged to record transactions in struggling city-states. Even the Phoenicians, who rose from the ashes, built their success on lessons learned, diversifying trade goods, establishing colonies as fallback hubs, keeping records on portable papyrus rather than fragile clay. Their resilience birthed the next era of Mediterranean prosperity. The ghost ports of the Bronze Age whisper a warning we do well to heed. Civilization thrives on connection, but survives only when those connections have flexibility built in. When the next crisis comes, whether climate disaster, war, or plague, it won't be the strongest empires that endure, but those who learn the oldest lesson of all: trade both giveth and it taketh away. The Silk Road's caravans didn't emerge from nowhere. They followed invisible tracks laid millennia earlier by Bronze Age merchants hauling tin and lapis lazuli. Those ancient traders would have instantly recognized the Hanseatic League's ledgers or the stamped seals on Venetian spice contracts, because the DNA of commerce hasn't changed. What began with Mesopotamian barley measures evolved into the standardized coinage of Lydia, the bills of lading in Geno's ships, and today's digital contracts flashing across fiber optic cables. The core ingredients remain identical: trust encoded in systems, value agreed upon collectively, and the unshakable belief that a stranger's promise can be as solid as gold. Consider the Silk Road's most famous innovation, the letter of credit. A Persian merchant in Chang'an could deposit silver with a moneylender and receive a paper note redeemable in Samarkand or Baghdad. This wasn't just convenient. It was a direct descendant of Mesopotamian temple tokens that represented stored grain. Even the Hanseatic League's strict quality controls echo Bronze Age practices, their inspectors marking barrels of herring with merchant seals, just as Hittite officials stamped copper ingots to guarantee purity. The scale expanded, but the principle stayed stubbornly familiar. Trade thrives when everyone plays by visible rules. Modern trade agreements, for all their legal complexity, still dance to this ancient rhythm. When nations today negotiate tariff reductions or intellectual property protections, they're engaging in the same delicate calculus as Egyptian pharaohs bartering with Canaanite city-states, weighing short-term concessions against long-term stability. The Trans-Pacific Partnership's dispute resolution clauses mirror Namu's law code from 2100 BCE, where neutral elders settled conflicts between Mesopotamian and Elamite traders. Even sanctions, our go-to economic weapon, were perfected by Assyrian kings who knew cutting off access to tin could cripple an enemy's bronze production faster than any siege. Yet the most profound legacy lies in the intangible. Those early trade routes didn't just move goods, they rewired human cognition. The concept of standardized weights birthed mathematics. Contract disputes spurred legal systems. Long-distance accounting gave us writing. Today's global supply chains, for all their complexity, still rely on these cognitive tools forged in ancient market stalls. When a Tokyo banker trusts a blockchain ledger or a Marseille dockworker follows ISO container standards, they're channeling the same problem-solving instincts that led a Sumerian merchant to carve notches on a clay tally. The lesson: civilization's greatest inventions aren't just objects or institutions, but the shared habits of mind that make cooperation possible across distance and difference. From the first barley loans in Uruk to the trillion-dollar flows of modern finance, the story of trade is ultimately the story of how strangers learned to trust, and in doing so, built the world we share today. The Queen of Sheba's legendary visit to King Solomon wasn't just a meeting of monarchs, it was a masterclass in economic diplomacy. Ancient texts describe her caravan stretching to the horizon, laden with gold, spices, and fragrant resins worth a kingdom's ransom. But look closer, this wasn't mere tribute. The Queen's gifts of frankincense and myrrh represented strategic trade goods from southern Arabia, commodities so valuable they funded entire cities. In return, Solomon offered something equally precious: access to Israel's burgeoning trade networks. Their exchange became immortal not because of its grandeur, but because it encapsulated a universal truth: even mythic rulers needed trade to sustain their power. Homer's Odysseus, that cunning hero of the ancient Greeks, spent as much time haggling as he did fighting monsters. In one often overlooked episode, he trades Phoenician merchants a golden cup for vital supplies to continue his voyage. This scene reveals what every ancient listener would have recognized: that survival itself depended on the ability to negotiate value across cultures. The Phoenicians, history's most feared sailors, weren't just pirates in these tales. They were the indispensable middlemen of the Mediterranean, as vital to the epic's plot as any sorceress or cyclops. These stories did more than entertain; they encoded practical wisdom. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh shows its hero trading cedar wood from distant forests to build his city's gates, a metaphor for how commerce could transform raw materials into civilization's foundations. Indian folktales of merchant princes outwitting greedy kings taught listeners to navigate unfair tariffs. Even the biblical Joseph, with his prophetic management of Egypt's grain reserves, became a folk hero for generations of traders who saw divine providence in prudent commodity speculation. What's striking is how these myths mirror archaeological finds. A shipwreck off Uluburun carried goods matching the Queen of Sheba's described treasures, while Mycenaean pottery in Egypt aligns with Homer's accounts of Greek-Phoenician exchanges. The line between legend and receipt blurs when Sumerian scribes recorded temple offerings. They often used the same poetic language found in hymns to trade gods like the Babylonian Nisaba, keeper of weights and measures. The deepest lesson lies in how these tales humanized commerce. A Phoenician trader in myth might be a trickster, but he was also a family man sending earnings home to Tyre. The Queen of Sheba's spices weren't abstract luxuries; they were the sweat of harvesters who braved desert winds to slash frankincense trees. By weaving trade into their foundational stories, ancient cultures acknowledged what we often forget: that every transaction, no matter how small, is a thread in the vast tapestry of human connection. From the incense routes of Arabia to the wine-dark seas of Homer's world, these narratives remind us that trade isn't just about goods, it's about the stories we tell to make sense of our interdependence. That clay tablet from ancient recording a shipment of wool might look nothing like today's digital spreadsheets tracking sneakers from Vietnam or microchips from Taiwan, but strip away the technology, and the human drama remains uncannily familiar. When a Mesopotamian merchant grumbled about tariffs at the gates of a foreign city, he was voicing the same frustrations as a modern exporter navigating customs forms. The Hittite king who stockpiled tin during trade disputes, he'd fit right in at a G20 summit debating supply chain resilience. What we call globalization isn't some shiny new phenomenon. It's the latest chapter in a story that began when the first farmer loaded his surplus grain onto a donkey and wondered, what else is out there? Take cultural blending, often seen as a modern concern. Walk through the ruins of ancient Carthage and you'll find amulets mixing Egyptian gods with Phoenician symbols, proof that cross-border trade has always reshaped identities. Just as TikTok trends now hop continents in hours, Bronze Age artisans copied Mycenaean dagger designs found in Syrian markets, while Indus Valley cooks experimented with Mesopotamian spices. The difference: today's fusion happens faster, but the impulse to borrow, adapt, and remix is as old as the first sailor who brought home a foreign souvenir. Economic inequality followed the same ancient script. Excavations at Pompeii reveal lavish villas with imported Egyptian marble, just blocks from cramped apartments where workers ate grain shipped from North Africa. Sound familiar? The gap between Dubai's skyscrapers and its migrant labor camps mirrors Rome's divide between senators dining on Baltic amber, braised peacock, and the dockworkers who unloaded it. Even solutions have ancient echoes. Babylon's debt forgiveness decrees foreshadow modern relief programs, while Egyptian grain dole systems anticipated social safety nets by millennia. Yet the most striking parallel lies in vulnerability. When the volcano at Thera erupted around 1600 BCE, it didn't just bury Akrotiri, it triggered tsunamis that wrecked Cretan ports, disrupting trade networks as far as Egypt. Substitute a pandemic for that eruption, and you've got 2020's shipping container backlog. The Hittites learned the hard way that relying on Egyptian grain made them hostages to Nile floods, just as Europe now rethinks energy dependence after pipeline shutdowns. History's lesson is clear. Every supply chain is a chain of risks, whether you're shipping tin on donkey back or lithium by supertanker. Perhaps the most hopeful legacy is how ancient traders turned rivals into partners. Enemies like Egypt and Hittite Empire still traded during wars because copper and grain mattered more than pride. Phoenician merchants collaborated with competitors to fund risky voyages, pooling resources like modern joint ventures. That pragmatic spirit, the understanding that mutual interest outweighs conflict, built the first threads of our interconnected world. So next time someone calls globalization a modern invention, remind them, the Babylonians were drawing up contracts, dodging tariffs, and complaining about middlemen long before anyone dreamed of a World Trade Organization. Deep in the archives of the ancient world, countless trade deals were recorded with painstaking precision: shipments of cedar weighed to the shekel, loans of silver with interest calculated down to the grain. Yet for every tablet that survives, there are a dozen stories lost to time, whispers of voyages and exchanges that slip through history's fingers like sand. Take the Minoans, those seafaring masters of Bronze Age Crete, whose vibrant frescoes show ships piled high with exotic goods. Their records speak of trade with Egypt and Anatolia, but tantalizing clues hint at connections far more mysterious. A single obsidian blade found in a Minoan palace traces back not to nearby islands, but to the distant volcanoes of Sardinia. How did it get there? Was it traded hand to hand across the Mediterranean, or did Minoan ships dare to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the stormy Atlantic? The answer sank with their ships, leaving us to wonder. Then there's the enigma of the Olmecs, the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica, whose colossal stone heads gaze silently across the jungles of Mexico. At the same time the Minoans ruled the Aegean, the Olmecs were carving jade and trading cacao across Central America. But here's the puzzle: a handful of artifacts, a jade bead with eerily Minoan-style spiral motifs, a clay figurine resembling a bull leaper, have sparked wild theories. Could a storm-blown Minoan galley have reached the Gulf of Mexico? Or did their trade networks, like invisible threads, stretch further than we ever imagined, passing goods through countless middlemen until origins were forgotten? The truth may lie buried in unexcavated shipwrecks or undiscovered caches, waiting for some future archaeologist's trowel to reveal it. The Mediterranean floor alone is a graveyard of unanswered questions. The Uluburan shipwreck, with its dazzling cargo of gold and amber, was a lucky find, but how many more rest in the abyss? A single storm could swallow a vessel carrying innovations that might have changed history. Imagine a ship laden with early iron samples from the Hittites, or scrolls containing lost mathematical theories, now dissolved into seawater. Even the goods we know existed sometimes vanish without a trace. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor, wrote of a legendary fire-resistant cloth traded from India, possibly an early asbestos textile. Not a single fragment survives. Some secrets were deliberately kept, Phoenician dye recipes guarded so closely that competitors couldn't replicate their famous purple, dyed with their makers. The exact location of the fabled tin mines that fueled the Bronze Age remains debated. Were they in Cornwall, Afghanistan, or somewhere still unknown? And what of the silent trade practices Herodotus described, where African tribes and Carthaginian merchants exchanged gold without ever meeting, leaving goods at a neutral site like some ancient eBay pickup? These gaps in the record aren't just missing puzzle pieces, they're reminders that for all our discoveries, the ancient world still holds cards close to its chest. Yet this isn't just about lost artifacts or vanished ships. Every unanswered question represents a ripple effect we'll never fully trace. Did some unknown trade route spread a technology that sparked a revolution? Could a sunken cargo have contained a cure or a philosophy that died at sea? The beauty of these mysteries is that they leave room for the next generation of explorers, whether armed with dive gear or satellite imagery, to rewrite the story. After all, the past isn't done speaking. It's just waiting for us to ask the right questions. From the first clay contracts stamped with royal seals to the sprawling digital marketplaces of today, the story of trade is the story of civilization itself. Those ancient merchants bartering cedar and Lapis Lazuli couldn't have imagined container ships or cryptocurrency, but they'd instantly recognize the underlying dance of trust, risk, and mutual need that still drives our world. Take something as modern as a smartphone, its components mined in Congo, assembled in Vietnam, designed in California, and you'll find the same interconnected web that once linked Mesopotamian weavers to Indus Valley cotton growers. The scale has changed, but the pattern remains. What's astonishing isn't just how much has endured, but how little we've reinvented. That Mesopotamian interest rate of 20%. It mirrors modern microloans, the Assyrian merchant's frustration with delayed tin shipments. Any logistics manager today would sympathize. Even the concept of globalization, often treated as a late 20th century phenomenon, was alive when Minoan pottery turned up in Egyptian tombs and Baltic amber graced Mycenaean palaces. The real innovation across 5 millennia hasn't been the idea of trade itself, but the countless ways we've refined its machinery, from stone weights to blockchain ledgers, from donkey caravans to algorithmic high-frequency trading. Yet the most profound legacy lies in trade's unintended consequences. When Phoenician ships carried alphabets alongside olive oil, or when Silk Road merchants spread paper-making techniques far beyond China, they were doing more than turning a profit. They were accidentally knitting together humanity's collective brain. Every time a Babylonian scribe noted the price of barley, a Venetian banker calculated interest, or a Wall Street trader tracked stock futures, they added another layer to systems that now govern everything from coffee prices to internet access. The ancient world's greatest trade wasn't in spices or silver, but in the very frameworks that let strangers cooperate across space and time. So as you scroll through global news feeds or tap to order groceries, remember, you're participating in a tradition older than the pyramids. Those age-old questions, who gets what, who decides, who benefits, still echo in every tariff dispute and supply chain hiccup. The next time someone calls trade a dry topic, point them to the drama etched in those clay tablets, the triumphs, the betrayals, the sheer audacity of people who looked beyond the horizon and whispered, "What if?" That spirit, equal parts pragmatism and imagination, is the real inheritance we've been trading all along. If this journey through ancient markets made you see today's economy in a new light, let's keep the conversation going. Which modern trade practice surprises you most with its ancient roots? Drop your thoughts below. And for more deep dives into history's hidden connections, don't forget to subscribe. After all, the next chapter of this story is being written every time someone, somewhere,